So Rationality Rules has recently made a video where he explains why he isn't vegan and why he thinks the rest of the world isn't vegan. And he also seems to think that he's undermined the ethical arguments for veganism and utilitarianism, for which I think he's failed. I'm a big fan of Rationality Rules and would recommend you guys go check out his channel. But yeah, even rational people tend to think a bit weirdly when it comes to the subject of animal ethics, and I think there's a lot of weird stuff going on in his latest video, to say the least. So let's check it out.
Let me make clear from the outset that I'm not claiming to have an ethical argument against veganism. No, I'm merely going to provide two reasons as to why I don't buy the case for ethical veganism, and I'll then controversially argue that most people subconsciously reject ethical veganism for one of the same reasons that I do.
Okay, so Stephen said that he doesn't have an ethical argument against veganism, but that he doesn't buy the ethical case for veganism. This statement alone, which he seems to be using specifically to clarify what he's trying to do, kind of does the opposite for me. He then goes on to say that he thinks that most people subconsciously reject veganism. And that also sounds a bit weird to me. Like when I think back to my many years of being a meat eater, was I subconsciously rejecting veganism? Now, while my actions contradicted my ethical beliefs, which by the way they still do when I spend surplus amounts of money on things I don't need all of the time, I don't think this equates to a subconscious rejection of veganism, which I've been convinced of since I first heard of it, I think. Rather, I think there are motivational issues that prevent us from acting in the way that we think we should. For example, Akrasia. So Akrasia basically means a lack of self-control, but saying Akrasia makes me sound smarter, which might make me more persuasive. Okay, so Akrasia, that's the third time. Do you see how compelling this is one reason why someone might not go vegan, even if they agree that we should try to reduce the suffering of animals.
According to the Effective Altruism Foundation, the strongest argument for veganism goes as follows. Premise 1. We shouldn't be cruel to animals. That is, we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily. Premise 2. The consumption of animal products harms animals. Premise 3. The consumption of animal products is unnecessary. Conclusion. Therefore, we shouldn't consume animal products. In and of itself, the argument is pretty simple. If we shouldn't unnecessarily harm animals, and the consumption of animal products unnecessarily harms animals, then trivially we shouldn't consume animals. It's that simple. Alright, well let's analyse each of these premises and then strengthen them when and where we can. Premise 1. We shouldn't be cruel to animals. That is, we shouldn't consume animal products unnecessarily. The statement that we shouldn't be cruel to animals is very compelling, since rejecting this implies that one is perfectly fine with animal cruelty. But without the word unnecessarily in the forefront, this premise is just false, as it's easy to conjure a situation in which being cruel to animals is justified. For instance, the poisoning of rats to prevent spread of disease. Killing rats with poison is, without doubt, extremely cruel. It's a very, very nasty death, but it can, in certain situations, be justified on account of it being necessary to keep children safe, etc.
So from my perspective, poisoning the rats to prevent the spread of disease would only be justified if the suffering endured by the rats would be less than the suffering caused to the hypothetical children he mentions. And we would also want to consider any flow-through effects of action or inaction to the best of our ability. I think when people use the words necessary or unnecessary, they often mean that something is necessary if you need to do it in order to survive or be healthy. But as Rationality Rules points out later in his video, statements like this seem anthropocentric. Like, why should one human be allowed to kill, say, 10,000 pigs just because it's necessary for his survival? I think that causing suffering is necessary when it is instrumentally outweighed by a greater reduction in suffering overall. That's what necessary should ethically mean in such statements. It's not about human survival.
Premise 2. The consumption of animal products harms animals. On a literal reading, this premise is just false. It's not the consumption of animal products that causes harm, but rather the process of acquiring the animal product that, more often than not, causes harm. When a hunter cooks and eats the deer, he's not harming the deer. No, he harmed the deer and the deer's kin, if it had any, when, in an act of pure masculinity, he equipped himself with an incredibly powerful and accurate weapon, found a safe space, and pulled the trigger from hundreds of feet away. Likewise, when someone, such as myself, cooks and eats an egg, I don't harm the chicken. No, I harm the chicken when, in an act of pure masculinity, I paid someone else, millions of feet away, to harvest the chicken period for me. So it's not the consumption of animal products in and of itself that causes harm, but rather the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings that causes harm. Now, I use the words deliberate acquisition because it carries the connotation of consciously and intentionally obtaining the product, and not necessarily with currency. If, for instance, I did some gardening for someone on the assumption that they'll cook me fish and chips as payment, or at least part of the payment, then make no mistake about it, I would be deliberately acquiring the fish. But suppose instead that I found a dead fish washed up on the beach and decided to take it home and eat it. In this case, is it fair to say that I harm the fish or deliberately obtain the fish? Well, as far as I'm convinced, the answer is no, and so I just don't see an explicit issue with such an act. To be clear, I've never done this, but given my understanding of ethical veganism, this seems perfectly consistent with it. Just so long, of course, I'm not deliberately walking along the beach to find dead fish. Now, some will argue that taking the fish harms other animals that would have otherwise consumed the fish, and while this objection is worth considering, I think it's ultimately nullified by the fact that vegans also harm surrounding animals when they forcibly occupy land to produce and consume crops. Thus, since both cases suffer the same objection, within the context of comparing the two cases, this objection can be ignored.
I agree with Stephen's analysis that, generally speaking, the harm is done when we buy the product, not when we consume it. But his point about not having to deal with the harm caused by taking the dead fish simply because vegans also harm animals in crop production, that doesn't seem to follow. Or to use one of his favourite terms, it's a non sequitur. Ironically, the guy who points out everyone else's fallacies seems to be making some sort of hypocrisy fallacy here. Namely, if you don't practice what you preach is nullified. If eating the dead fish on the beach is causing harm to animals, then he should accept that it's bad. And then he can also criticize the vegans for the harm that he alleges they are causing. Of course, it's worth noting that the majority of crops we produce are going towards feeding farmed animals, so we would expect to cause fewer crop-related deaths from eating a vegan diet compared to a non-vegan diet. But even so, I think that the harm caused by the crops I eat is bad, and we should work towards producing crops in a way that minimizes harm to animals. But I also think it makes sense to focus on the issues that are causing the most suffering, like animal farming, especially when abolishing animal farming would eliminate the most significant cause of crop deaths. And it might also be difficult to get people to take crop deaths seriously, while collectively we are still accepting the torture of animals on factory farms and slaughterhouses like we are today. And this is besides the point really, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I'm not actually sure that taking the fish away and eating it yourself would lead to an increase in harm. It might be the case that if we leave the fish there will be more animals born in the future. If those animals live very short lives and have terrible deaths, then it could be the case that taking the fish away and eating it yourself would lead to a reduction in overall harm.
To get back on the rails, the question is, does the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings harm sentient beings? At a glance, the answer is obviously yes. When I buy a pint of milk, I pay for an industry to harm sentient beings. However, there are some interesting objections that are worthwhile mentioning. For instance, in order to acquire the milk, it's necessary to ensure that the cow receives adequate shelter and sustenance, which in the state of nature they often don't. From this, it can be argued, then, that on average farming increases the well-being of animals. What's more, if it wasn't for humans consuming animal produce, then billions of animals wouldn't have existed and thus experienced any happiness in the first place. Now, while a fair few find these objections compelling, I'm not among them. We'd never apply these objections to humans. That is, we'd never say that since we provide shelter and sustenance to other humans, we can confine them and end their life prematurely. Or that if we didn't eat other humans, they would never experience any happiness in the first place. And once human comparison comes up, the dialectic spirals in 1,000 different directions, and so we'll put a pin in it here.
So Stephen is talking about how someone could argue that from a classical utilitarian perspective, if farmed animals had lives that consisted of more pleasure than suffering, then animal farming would be justified. And he then goes on to point out that we wouldn't accept this in a human context, so we shouldn't accept it in an animal context. I would add that I'm very uncertain about the extent to which pleasurable states can outweigh suffering. And to illustrate my point, let me tell you about something incredibly fucked up. I mean, I was thinking I was going to go to the doctor before I showed people this, but I'm just going to get it. I'm just going to get it out now. I'm incredibly childish, especially given what I'm about to tell you. What I'm about to tell you really is this is fucked up. Way more fucked up than my penis. And that's not saying much because there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, back to normal. Let's go. The Brazen Bull was allegedly a torture device designed in ancient Greece. And the bull was said to be hollow and made entirely out of bronze with a door on one side. The victims were locked inside, and a fire was set under it, heating the metal until the person inside was roasted to death. And it's been speculated that people might have been able to survive up to 20 minutes in the bull. It's hard for me to imagine the amount of pleasure you would need to outweigh suffering like that. And when I think about some of the most intense experiences that farmed animals are going through, like the millions of unfortunate chickens who are being boiled alive in scalding tanks, I don't think that would be outweighed even if the rest of their lives were good. And of course, we know that the rest of their lives aren't good either. Anyway, the point is, it's this kind of thinking that leads me to care much more about reducing extreme suffering compared to increasing the amount of pleasurable experiences in the world. Okay, sorry about that tangent, let's go back to the video.
Which premise, then, do I reject? Well, I reject premise 1, and for 2 reasons. Let's spell out the first. As vegans are well aware, vegan diets raise many moral questions of their own, and one such question is this. What does it mean to say that the deliberate acquisition of a product is necessary? Necessary for what? Most vegans claim that they deliberately acquire products that harm sentient beings because it's necessary for them, as an individual, to live. Now, the following question might seem a little strange, but it's absolutely a fair philosophical query. How does the vegan determine that their life is worth more than the mice and moles sacrificed in their crops? If the avoidance of harm is so paramount, why does one human life supersede 1,000 mice or 1,000,000 insects? Most people take for granted that living is necessary, and so we don't tend to focus on this implicit premise, this definition of unnecessary. But as far as I can tell, this definition is completely arbitrary. It simply assumes that, in principle, it's perfectly fine to maintain one human life at the expense of infinite harm caused to infinite beings, just so long as there's no alternative method of maintaining the human's life without such harm.
As I said, I actually have sympathy with Stephen's issues with the word unnecessary. It seems to me that that framing of something being necessary or practicable has some sort of implicit anthropocentric bias. In other words, and I'm going to use the term that people don't like saying because it's hard to say and it sounds kind of weird, I think it's speciesist. On the other hand, I think using the term unnecessary when talking about animal farming is fine because, well, it works, doesn't it? It's like people find it very intuitive that we should try to avoid causing unnecessary suffering when we can. So I'll say it when I'm talking to people, even if I'm not really down with it in the philosophical sense, but I'm talking more colloquially. Colloquially. That sounds compelling, doesn't it? And as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about ethics, I think that necessary should refer to something being necessary to prevent or reduce greater amounts of suffering elsewhere. And as I alluded to, there's a separate question of whether using the more common definition of necessary would be more effective in actually getting people to change. And we're currently causing animals to be tortured for trivial human pleasures anyway. It's not like we're doing it for our survival.
The question is, what does it mean to say that a product is necessary? Is it to live? And if so, to what degree? Is it to live a fully healthy life, or just to live at the cost of, perhaps, a reduction of optimum performance and lifespan? Or at least a reduction in some of the foods we enjoy that are technically vegan, such as almonds? Like, seriously, where's the line here?
There is no line. Morality isn't black and white and can't simply be boiled down to moral or immoral, or vegan or non-vegan. I would say that actions or inactions are better or worse, or more moral or less moral, based on the amount of suffering reduced. Perhaps having sharp lines for morality resonates with people because for thousands of years, religions have told us that there are sharp lines between good and evil, between something being haram or halal. And maybe even for secular people like Rationality Rules, having these sharp lines is appealing because it makes their guiding principles easier to follow. But life just isn't that simple. I think that we are all doing many ethically good things and many ethically bad things, and we can always strive to move our line towards a more ethical location.
To wrap up this objection, though, the definition of unnecessary does most of the heavy lifting, and by my lights at least, it's completely arbitrary to say that one human life supersedes countless non-human animals.
Stephen goes on to say that by using the term unnecessary, vegans are saying that one human life supersedes countless non-human animals' lives. But I'm pretty sure that most vegans wouldn't subscribe to the belief that one human life supersedes countless non-human animals' lives. No, it is in fact non-vegans who would be more likely to believe such nonsense. Okay, so let's move on to what I think is probably the weirdest part of his video.
Utilitarians then affirm the first premise of the ethical vegan argument. To unnecessarily harm sentient beings is to minimize happiness and maximize suffering. However, I think that utilitarians are subtly but significantly mistaken in their assessment. Bentham died in 1832, 27 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species, but we today are so fortunate as to stand on the shoulders of both of these giants. As far as our current understanding goes, primates evolved around 55 million years ago, and most species of primate today, perhaps all, have very complex sociality. The benefits of social species include excellent anti-predation response, increased resource detection, cooperative learning, and so on, and crucially, these traits are more akin to software as opposed to hardware. Take, for instance, the intuition not to unnecessarily harm one's kin. This intuition is so overwhelmingly etched in us that it strikes us as almost transcendent, and for many as literally transcendent, almost as if, to borrow biblical language, it's written on our heart. And the fact that almost all of us intuit this principle speaks of how heavily nature has, over eons, aggressively selected for it. Or to put this another way, our ancestors that inherited the don't unnecessarily harm your kin .intuition patch had a survival advantage over those who didn't. The same is true of those who inherited the don't unnecessarily steal from your kin .intuition patch. Now, while most social species simply run the script and get on with their life, never questioning why they have the intuition, in recent millennia humans have been asking why. Why do we have this intuition? What is morality? What is this standard? What makes something right or wrong? And ethical veganism is, by my lights at least, the result of answering this question in the tone resembling Bentham. The subtle but significant issue though, and here's where my second objection begins, is that I think that ethical vegans, and indeed utilitarians, have misdiagnosed our moral software. We're not running the patch "we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily." No, definitely not. We're predators, for crying out loud. We're running the patch "we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily," and thus, per my first response, I not only believe that the first premise rests on an arbitrary implicit premise, but worse, per this second response, I think that the arbitrary implicit premise that most people affirm isn't actually the premise they say they affirm. While most people say that they affirm the premise that we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily, I think that what they're actually affirming is we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily.
It seems to me that he's trying to debunk veganism and utilitarianism by claiming that the ought statement utilitarians make isn't the same as the actual reason why our sense of morality evolved. But why would this undermine utilitarianism? Stephen talks about how utilitarians have misdiagnosed our moral software as if we're making empirical claims about the origin of our sense of morality, rather than a prescriptive claim about how we ought to act, which surely doesn't need to be beholden to the origin of our intuitions. Veganism and utilitarianism are philosophies about how we ought to act. They're not descriptive claims about the origins of morality. I believe that we ought to minimize suffering, and I also recognize that our moral software likely stems back from evolutionary aspects like kin selection, altruistic reciprocity, and inter versus intra-group competition, among other things.
Now, needless to say, if you're a fan of objective moral values and duties, then you probably disagree with me. Fine, I get that.
I pure, straight, hate you.
But whether you agree with me or not, surely you can see the explanatory scope of my view. It makes a lot of sense of historical moral development and also contemporary moral disagreement. It's a consistent story.
But god damn it, do I respect you.
Stephen claims that if you believe in objective moral values, then you probably disagree with him, which seems weird, right? Because clearly all he's doing is making an empirical argument about why people behave the ways they do. I mean, someone can believe in objective morality or not believe in it and still understand the evolutionary origins of human behavior. One's meta-ethical position seems like a bit of a red herring given Stephen's focus on explanations at this point.
Anyhow, to reiterate my view in relation to the argument, I'm rejecting the first premise altogether. While the proposition that we shouldn't unnecessarily harm sentient beings strikes me as intuitively correct, upon assessment it seems to me that the actual proposition that we accept, that is, the software we're actually running, is we shouldn't unnecessarily harm our kin.
So here he seems to make a naturalistic fallacy. In other words, because we evolved to avoid unnecessarily harming our kin, that should be premise one, that we ought to avoid unnecessarily harming our kin. But I don't know, man, after being a fan of Rationality Rules for such a long time, it does feel strange to me that this isn't obvious to him, so I'm wondering if I'm just missing something here, or if I'm not understanding his argument properly. And if so, oops. I would agree with him that we can find evolutionary reasons for why people care more about their own family compared to strangers, or they care more about humans over pigs. But I think evidence and reason can help us overcome our biased intuitions. It's like, sure, I might have evolved intuitions to care much more about my child than African children on the other side of the world. But reason can get me to the point where I think that donating to prevent the child from dying of malaria is more important than taking my own already healthy and happy child to Disney World.
With all of this said, however, during the month it's taken to produce this video, I further reduced my dairy and egg consumption, and if the world keeps going the way it's going, I'll probably be vegan within the year. But it won't be because I buy the ethical vegan argument. It won't be because our circle of altruism should extend to all sentient beings. No, it will simply be either one, because my circle of altruism will extend to all sentient beings, courtesy of socio-economic and environmental privileges, or two, because my tribe circle will extend to all sentient beings, and because my well-being is tethered to my tribe. And because my well-being is tethered to my tribe, I'll sing their song.
I think Stephen makes important points about the importance of social influences in shaping our behaviour, and I agree that it will probably play an important role in spreading veganism. But I also think that shifts in our behaviours and attitudes are influenced by ethical arguments. I think a wide range of factors, including social influence, including ethical arguments, and many other variables, lead to shifts in our attitudes and behaviours. And unless I'm mistaken, Rationality Rules undermines his own point about how humans aren't being influenced by ethical arguments, because literally in his own video, he says,
and if you think I'm mistaken, let me know. If I'm mistaken in my assessment, I want to know. The very reason I'm vegetarian as opposed to, say, pescatarian is because I'm sensitive to the arguments.
Are you sensitive to the arguments though? Or are you just running the wrong software? Of course, in line with his view, any objection to slavery or the Holocaust could also be described as misdiagnosing our moral software, since it's not actually doing what it was evolved for. But since we are all the result of evolution, you could argue that everyone from Peter Singer to Adolf Hitler is almost by definition acting in accordance with evolution. And more importantly, our moral software wasn't actually evolved with any intention in mind. Evolution has no goals or morality, and it's indifferent to the experience of the sentient beings who live on this planet. So forgive me if the way I want the world to be goes beyond the evolutionary origins of our intuitions. I want to live in a world where people ask the question, what if it were me, more often. I want to live in a world where everybody gets to live a good life, regardless of their genetic relatedness to me. Not everyone will agree with me on that, but I think striving for that world will lead to this place being a much better place to live than striving to act in accordance with the evolutionary origins of morality. Yes, kin selection undoubtedly influenced our moral intuitions, but in light of this empirical fact, how should we act? Should we label any argument that goes beyond caring for our kin as a misdiagnosis? Or should we recognise that we are not slaves to our evolutionary story? Evolution is indifferent to the experience of the sentient beings who live on this planet. We don't have to be. Anyway, I do appreciate Rationality Rules talking about the issue of animal suffering, and I think he has a great channel, despite my myriad of disagreements with him on this. A big thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel, and I will see you guys very soon with another video.